Imagine you're standing on a wooden deck. No roof, no walls, just open sky, freezing wind, and an ocean that wants to pull you under. You're a Viking. Your ship is sealed with tar. One spark, and everything burns. So here's the question that has puzzled historians for centuries. How did Vikings heat their ships on icy seas without fire? No torches. No campfires. No flames at all. And yet, they crossed the North Atlantic. They reached Iceland, Greenland, even North America. How? Before we answer that, take a moment. Subscribe to Little Historical if you love real history, not just myths. And let me know in the comments, what's the coldest place you've ever been? Now, let's travel back. Into the freezing dark. Into the mind of a Viking. And discover the 4 strange, desperate, and brilliant ways they kept warm when fire was forbidden. You are standing on a freezing deck, and the only thing between you and death is a tiny clay box no bigger than your hands. Inside it, no flame, no fire, just a handful of glowing embers buried in ash, breathing so slowly you have to press your ear against the clay to know if they are still alive. The Vikings called it the sleeping fire. And on a ship soaked in pine tar, where one spark means floating funeral pyre, this little box was everything. It was not warm. You could hold your palm an inch above it and feel almost nothing. But it was proof that fire still existed somewhere in this frozen purgatory. And that small truth kept men sane. Every night, the crew would gather around that clay pot, not because it gave heat, but because it gave hope. They would sit in silence, watching the faint orange glow seep through the cracks, and for a few moments, the wind did not feel quite so personal. But keeping that fire asleep was a kind of torture. Someone had to stay awake, crouched over the box, blowing gently into the ash whenever the glow began to fade. Too hard, and the embers would spark. Too soft, and they would die. It was an intimate, almost dangerous relationship between a man and a sleeping flame. And the man who held that duty carried more than warmth. He carried the crew's sanity in a jar. If he failed, if the embers turned to cold dust, there was no second chance. No lighter. No matches. Just frozen fingers trying to strike flint on a moving deck while 20 other men watched in silence, knowing that without that fire, the next landfall would be cold and dark and miserable. The sagas do not speak much about the Ember Keeper, but you can feel his weight in the spaces between the verses. He was the one who never fully slept, who whispered to the coals like lovers in the dark, who knew that a tiny glow was more precious than gold. And when the ship finally reached shore, that sleeping fire was awakened. Federation coaxed into a real flame. The crew would gather around it, not cheering, just breathing. Because they had carried life across the sea in a clay box. And that is how the first night ended. But the cold never sleeps. And neither did they. Because warmth was not something they had. It was something they became. And what they became next is stranger still. And when the sleeping fire failed to warm their bones, the Vikings turned to the only thing left. Their own skin. But not naked. Never naked. They wrapped themselves like secrets, layer upon layer, until the cold could not find where one man ended and the next began. The first layer was linen, pressed against the flesh like a second shadow. Linen does not hold water. It lets it pass, carries it away from the body, so that the skin stays dry even when the world is drowning. Above that came the wool. Thick, itchy, heavy with lanolin, the natural grease that still clings to the fibers. And here is the intimate truth the sagas barely whisper. That wool was often left unwashed on purpose. The oils from the sheep, mixed with the oils from the man, created a barrier that wind could not pierce. It smelled. Of course it smelled. But smell is a small price when the alternative is frostbite carving its name into your fingers. Then came the fur. Bear. Seal. Reindeer. Pelts so dense that you could bury your face in them and forget, for one dizzy moment, that the sea was trying to kill you. The Vikings did not wear fur for fashion. They wore it because fur traps air. And trapped air is the difference between waking up and not. But the strangest layer, the one that feels almost forbidden to mention, was the grease. Animal fat. Tallow. Rendered from the same beasts they ate. They would rub it into their wool, into their boots, into the seams of their cloaks. It was messy. Intimate. You would watch the man beside you smear white fat across his chest, his arms, his thighs, and you would do the same, because vanity died on the first freezing night. The grease repelled water. And water, more than cold, was the true enemy. A wet man dies. A greased man shivers but survives. And the boots. God, the boots. Simple leather wraps, more suggestion than shoe. But inside, dried grass. Sedge. Moss. They would pack it in with their fingers, pressing gently, shaping the nest for their feet. And when the grass froze solid by morning, they would pull it out, toss it to the sea, and pack fresh grass. Every day. Every dawn. The cold demanded constant renewal, constant touch, constant attention. And that was the hidden warmth. Not the layers themselves, but the ritual of preparing them. The way men checked each other's knots, straightened each other's cloaks, pressed a hand to a shoulder to feel if the fur was thick enough. They became a single body dressed in borrowed heat. And when the wind howled, they did not run from it. They leaned in. Because they knew that the next layer was not wool or fur. It was each other. And that is where the true fire lived. And so they leaned into each other. Not as warriors. Not as brothers in the saga sense. But as furnaces. Living, breathing furnaces wrapped in damp wool and denial. When the sleeping fire gave almost nothing and the layers still let the cold seep through like a lover who refuses to leave, the Vikings did the only thing left. They took the ship tent. A heavy sheet of coarse wool or sailcloth, waterproofed with animal fat until it smelled of secrets and survival. They stretched it across the middle of the longship, anchoring the corners with oars, shields, and the weight of exhausted men. It was not a room. It was a cave made of cloth. And inside that cave, 20 to 30 bodies pressed together in the dark. There was no space for modesty. No room for the careful distances that polite society demands. Shoulder against shoulder. Back against chest. Breath against neck. The tent trapped their exhaled air, warm and moist, and held it close like a hand over a mouth. The temperature inside rose by only a few degrees. But a few degrees can mean the difference between shivering and sleeping. Between waking up and not. And here is the intimate truth that history often smooths over. They slept tangled. Legs intertwined. Arms draped across strangers. One man's cloak covering two. Another man's fur draped over three. The sagas call them ship brothers. But that word hides the awkwardness, the vulnerability, the way you learn the rhythm of another man's breathing before you learn his name. Condensation built up on the inside of the tent until it rained from within. Cold droplets falling on cold faces. No one moved. No one complained. Because moving meant breaking the seal, letting the warm air escape, and starting the desperate negotiation all over again. They lay still, pretending to sleep, while the sea rocked them like a reluctant mother. And in that pretense, something strange happened. Their bodies synchronized. Heartbeats slowed. Breathing deepened. The cold did not vanish, but it became bearable. Shared. Divided among 20 men until each one carried only a fraction of the weight. That was the true heat. Not fire. Not fur. But the quiet, almost unbearable intimacy of survival. When dawn finally broke and the tent came down, no one spoke of it. They just rode. Because the night was over. And the next one was coming. And the only way to survive that one was to do it all again. But the Vikings had one more secret. Something they carried not on their bodies but in their minds. And it changed everything. And that secret, the one they carried not in their chests but between their ears, was this: they never truly believed they needed fire at all. The cold was not an enemy to be defeated. It was a companion to be tolerated. A test sent by gods who valued suffering more than comfort. The Vikings did not pray for warmth. They prayed for endurance. And that subtle shift, that intimate reframing of pain, changed everything. While other sailors hugged their coastlines, afraid of the freezing deep, the Vikings pushed north. Not because they were immune to frostbite, but because they had learned to interpret shivering as conversation rather than warning. They also knew something that modern romanticism forgets: they did not sail the icy seas in winter. Not if they could help it. The great voyages to Iceland, Greenland, and Vinland happened in late spring, summer, and early autumn. They watched the skies, the wind, the behavior of seals. They waited for the narrow windows when the sea was merely cruel instead of murderous. That was not cowardice. That was wisdom dressed in patience. And patience, like wool, is its own kind of insulation. When the cold became unbearable, they reminded themselves that the journey had an end. Every freezing night was one night closer to land. Every numb toe was a story for the half. They did not fight the cold. They bargained with it. They told themselves that the ice on their beards was a kind of jewelry, that the wind screaming in their ears was a song composed just for them, that to feel nothing at all would be worse than feeling too much. And here is the most forbidden truth of all: some of them came to crave it. The sharp clarity of near death. The way the world simplified down to breath and movement and the warmth of the man pressed against your back. On land, life was complicated. Farming, debt, family obligations. At sea, there was only survival. And survival, for all its terror, is simple. Pure. Almost holy. They did not need fire because fire would have broken the spell. Fire would have made them comfortable. And comfort, to a Viking, was the real enemy. Comfort made you soft. Soft made you dead. So they sailed into the freezing dark with nothing but wool, grass, and each other. And they called it warmth. Because in the end, warmth is not a temperature. It is a decision. And they had already decided.